All right, so hello everybody. Today we have another book review. This might be one of our most interesting recordings yet. We are sitting in the parking lot at 6:50 in the morning doing this interview. It's a beautiful morning.
The school parking lot, might I add.
No, it's a beautiful morning, so it's a great time to talk about books. Today we have a pretty interesting, not really a book, more of a short story, most definitely a short story. It's called Bobok. It's written by Mr. Fyodor Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky, of course he can pronounce that. He is one of the most famous Russian novelists of all time. Me and Ethan covered his White Nights in the spring, and I think we both really enjoyed that.
Yeah, we did. It was interesting.
It was really digestible, really easy to understand. Bobok is a little bit harder to understand. That's the novella that we're covering today, Bobok.
It's a short story.
By Dostoevsky. It's a short story. I'll let Ethan kind of get started with it. Basically, for a very brief overview, it's about a man who goes to a funeral, and he sits down and he's able to hear the occupants of the graves talking to each other.
Spirits, I guess.
Spirits.
Yeah, but, the way that he used was souls. But, yeah. Like Luke mentioned, we have our main character, Ivan. I'm not really sure how you're supposed to pronounce it. But he is an author for... an author/translator.
He just
He does anything with the written word. But
he hasn't had much success writing his own works.
No, yeah. He wants to be an author, but he's having a hard time getting his stuff into publications and convincing editors to even look at his work, and that's very frustrating. So he makes most of his money from translating things from French into what I presume to be Russian, because it is
I think Voltaire he was translating.
Yeah. A few notable works that he was translating. I believe he was translating them into Russian because the short story was originally written in Russian, of course, but it never really says. But
he also has some animosity towards what he's translating.
Yeah.
He says at one point, nobody cares about Voltaire. Nobody cares.
Yeah.
So I don't think he's really happy with his work, but he likes to write.
Right, and he's translating the works for the monarchy in Ivan. He mentions that he was translating the works for His Majesty, which we presume to be a monarch of some kind. I'm not sure if
it's French or Tsarist.
Yeah, I'm not sure if Dostoevsky meant for this to be a realistic fiction type work.
I'm assuming not.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, I mean, because I think he does both French and Russian translations.
Yeah.
So he could be translating for either one.
Yeah.
But yeah, so he's doing all this translating work. And is it his friend that dies? It's a friend.
It's a cousin.
Pilot. Cousin. Okay.
It's a cousin. Yeah.
A cousin. His cousin dies, and he goes to the funeral, and his descriptions of the funeral is really interesting.
Yeah.
All these people he says they're feigning mourning.
Mm-hmm.
They're not really that upset. He even says sometimes there's a jeer and joy.
Yeah.
At the funeral.
He says that some people. He didn't say that everyone was faking it.
No, but he just says it was present there.
Yes, it was. He says that some were mourning and some were just happy that the person was dying. Apparently, it was a college counselor. Apparently, it was a very polemic person. I don't know why a college counselor would be so polemic, but that's not the point. But before he had to go to the funeral, he actually had a friend come up to him and ask when he was going to sober up.
Yeah.
Because his friend had noticed that his writing style was getting choppy and that he was using parenthetical clauses everywhere and then putting more stuff in parentheses.
Yeah.
And his friend didn't think it was like Ivan to be writing that way. And Ivan kind of reflects on this, and he says, you know what, they're right, I need a distraction. I need some diversion. So he decided to go to a funeral, and that's how.
You do.
Yeah, right. Of course, if you were bored and needed a distraction, why wouldn't you just go to a funeral? It makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Like Luke said, they're at the funeral, and
kind of look back, he had been hearing this sound repeatedly,
yeah,
Bobok, for a while.
Bobok.
He didn't really know what it was.
Yeah.
He figures this out in a minute, but he goes to the funeral, like you said.
Yeah, like Luke said. He kept hearing the word Bobok, Bobok. And a Bobok actually means, translated from Russian to English, little bean, or nonsense. Yes, two translations. So the latter translation is the one that is particularly relevant for the story. So Ivan's at the funeral, and he has to help carry the coffin to the grave. And he says that coffins are always heavier with dead people in it.
Well, they are.
Right. And
it's a dead away.
But the way he said it, he said it in a way that contrasted it against coffins with live people in there, which I know doesn't make much sense, but he meant that when someone dies, their body loses a type of inertia that makes them lighter, and he said that went beyond common sense, that it didn't make any sense.
No, and he has a really interesting point here. He says he hates when people in economics try to make scientific observations.
Right.
And he says, it's really interesting. It's just kind of stay in your lane here. He says he says regular people have no means to make scientific statements like that, which I don't think is true. I mean, I think that's pretty common sense, but I'm not really sure what he was trying to get at from that statement. But I thought it was interesting how he put it.
Well, I think I won't spoil the end of the book right now because we're going to get there, but he put it in a way that's really relevant to the end of the story.
Well, yeah, I mean, classes and...
Sure, but he said that engineers shouldn't be making arguments about politics, and everyday people shouldn't be making opinions about military maneuvers because neither are qualified to not have opinions, but to
make informed opinions.
Right. And it's really off-putting to him how people do. But, so he's kind of just mumbling to himself. Dostoevsky purposely makes our character Ivan to be out as somewhat of a lunatic, I guess.
I think every character he writes has mental
struggles
like that. I mean, the main character, I'm blanking on the name, back in White Nights was like that.
Mm-hmm.
I read Dreams of a Ridiculous Man. It's like that. Notes from the Underground. All of his characters have some type of mental struggle.
Yeah.
Have you heard of Jordan Peterson?
Yes.
Jordan Peterson did a lecture on Dostoevsky, and he talks about how he's one of the most incredible writers that portrays the mind of man.
Yeah, psychology.
Psychology.
Yeah.
And I think you get that with this character too. But yes, he's very, I don't know what the word is exactly for it, but
he's precise with his knowledge of the human psyche.
Yes.
And he's not afraid to make it look crazy.
But the character in this story, he's very
aloof.
Yeah.
Yeah,
he's a strange guy.
Yeah.
But yeah, he goes to the funeral and he just kind of he wanders off.
Yeah,
basically.
He's kind of in La La Land, thinking about the funeral. He's proud of himself because he didn't go to some dinner party. And okay, I'm not sure why you'd be proud of yourself, but that's fine. And he ends up going to.
Do you think it's out of spite?
Maybe, because he didn't like this cousin. But he ends up going to the cemetery where the graves are laid, and he just sits down, and he kind of just fades.
He's just thinking about all this type of stuff. At this point, it was kind of confusing because
there's no clear transition.
No, you leave the outside where I said, well, did he die?
Right.
Because I thought maybe he had died on the bench, and that's how he was able to hear all the voices speak. But that's kind of getting ahead of putting the cart before the horse here. He's sitting there, and he starts hearing people talk. And he's really not sure at first what it is, but he hears somebody say, General.
Yeah.
And he looks down at the grave he's sitting on, and it's Major General, what's his name?
I don't remember.
It's Vasily.
These are all Russian
heavy
names.
Russian names.
Yeah.
They're all 20 letters long, so it's kind of hard to pronounce. But the general, so he said, well, oh my God, that's him.
Yeah.
And then you basically leave the main story in the real world aside, and you just hear these conversations between these spirits.
It reminded me of the purgatory of sorts.
Yeah, they're just waiting there. I think in the novella, it says for about 3 months. They're kind of in this stage of consciousness before they go on to whatever's next.
Yeah.
So it's basically this shortened period of time. But yeah, he's sitting there and he's listening to all these people talk. And I think he does communicate with them also.
Yeah.
A lot of them know each other from real life.
Yes, they do.
And they hate each other.
Yeah, there was a married couple. There was a philosopher and
a pervert.
Yeah, a pervert
and a 16-year-old or 15-year-old girl that's very excitable. If that's the word for it. She's wild.
Yeah. There were a wide variety of people.
Yes.
And I don't really believe that any of the conversations were too important specifically, but
I think that was the point too.
Right. And that was the point. I was reading a commentary on the work, and the point that Dostoevsky was trying to get at was that he wanted to point out the flaw in society.
Yeah.
That people are more concerned with gossiping.
Well, yeah, but they have this final chance at consciousness to see
Right.
each other again, and
they
they're
gossip.
arguing.
Yeah, they're gossiping and arguing. And Dostoevsky sees a huge flaw in that. He hates that people would rather gossip and argue than reflect on life. And he sees that in this afterlife of sorts where they're just arguing instead of reflecting on the past maybe up to 80 years that they've lived.
They're openly talking about things that they did to each other,
Right.
how they wronged each other in real life.
And maybe that's a sort of repentance, but
yeah, but I don't think so, because they're saying it
either.
in a manner where you can't do anything about it now.
Yeah, and it's almost in a spiteful way.
Yeah, and our main character, Ivan, he basically says he doesn't know what to do. Should he report to the police? But he can't do anything. I mean, so, and some of the things that they did to each other were terrible.
Yeah.
They stole money from each other. They, stabbed each other in the back. So it was interesting hearing, all these people, they live their whole lives, and then they're dead, and they get this final chance to kind of be with each other. And it's just like, screw everybody.
Right.
I
The
thought that was...
the souls are talking amongst themselves, and they notice that they can speak to each other and they can smell each other. And that's strange, like a strange combination. And they eventually figured out that they can smell each other's souls stinking, like the wretchedness
because
of
they're
their
terrible.
souls. Right, because they're awful people. And I thought that was really on the nose.
Yeah, and at that point, their real life occupations didn't matter anymore. Like the Major General, at one point, I forget which character states this, but he says, that's not important anymore.
Yeah.
He says, your sword can't do nothing here.
Yeah.
And he says, in 3 months, you'll just be 6 buttons on the ground. You know what I mean?
Right.
You won't be anything. And you can tell it bothers the general a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And which character states that, I'm blanking on the name, but it was a female. She states that we should be completely honest here. And that's how this whole thing kind of gets started with everybody. The ghosts are very...
There's no clear path of dialogue.
No.
They jump in and out very quickly.
So it could have really been anybody. But he or she states that, we're here. We can't touch each other.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just be completely honest with each other. I mean, what doesn't matter now? And that kind of gets the ball rolling on, everybody doing or saying what they said.
And something that we neglected to mention earlier was that when our main character, Ivan, was self-reflecting in the earlier part of the story, he kind of thinks about madhouses and people who are diagnosed as maybe clinically insane.
Yeah.
And he says that they're locked up in houses. And he finds that, or hospitals of sorts, right? Mm-hmm. Madhouses. And he finds that kind of amusing because he says, just because you're crazier than I am, doesn't mean I'm crazy. Me locking you in a madhouse doesn't make me any less crazy. and he thinks it's very hypocritical and somewhat ironic that people feel the authority to lock up someone because they're crazy when they could be just as crazy. They just show it in a different way.
He makes many points in a story.
He does.
A lot of them, some of them I don't think connect.
No.
To his main idea of the story. But I think if the reader is willing to take a leap of faith and make those wild connections, they could make connections.
Oh, yes, for sure.
For sure. You could, Dostoevsky is the type of writer where you could really, really delve into what he's trying to say.
It's like an English teacher's dream.
Yeah, I mean, because he says little things that are profound, yes, but you're like, why did he say that for?
Right.
That doesn't really connect to the story. But yeah, and he also mentions earlier on how the funeral, of how the cemetery is set up, the classes. First class, second class, third class. Is it first class that's like underneath the church? It's like really, really expensive.
I think so.
And then the classes, the farther back you get, the poorer the people are. So Ivan in the story, he's sitting here talking to these people, I think in the third class. And he's seeing how they interact with each other. And then he leaves. And at this point he says, well, I really enjoyed my experience, kinda. He thought it was profound, but he was also wildly disappointed with how the people behaved. He does claim at that point that he wants to see what the other classes are like, to see if they are any different interacting with each other. And I'm not sure if they would be. Do you think a richer people would be more?
Well, obviously there will be some differences.
But I think it would be worse.
I don't know whether it would be better or worse, but I would agree that no matter, I don't generally like hierarchies.
Because he does talk about the common people a lot in this story.
When I hear caste, I think of like India, where there was strict.
This isn't a structured caste system, but it's an informal caste system,
basically. And informal caste systems develop
naturally. It's what people can afford.
And they're kind of like niches. And those develop naturally, but like a regionally enforced, structured, like you said, caste system, kind of like what was saw in India, I don't think that's beneficial whatsoever.
Well, it's not beneficial,
it's
but
harmful.
Absolutely, but I think here you see, all these people knew each other in real life, and they were all able to afford graves in the same area.
Yes, that's true.
In real life, they were in a class to themselves also. People who had that amount of money, who could do certain things in that society. So they were interacting with each other in real life. I think that has something to do with an informal caste system.
And Ivan also mentioned earlier that the smell of the graves was absolutely horrendous. And
they're filled with water too.
Yeah, they're filled with water. And he says that he doesn't know how the clergyman could do it. But then he's like, oh, well, look at the coffins around here. They're nice-looking coffins. They're really expensive coffins. And he says, well, the clergyman must be making a lot of money, so that must justify it for them. And
I thought that imagery was really well.
It was incredibly.
It's talking about the green water and how the gravediggers were paling it out.
That was bucket by bucket. But I don't know. He's very cynical. I've read multiple testimonials that Dostoevsky had a supreme understanding of the human psyche throughout all of his books. I haven't read his other works like
Crime and Punishment,
or Brothers Karamazov, but I have read that they show the human psyche incredibly well and incredibly accurately.
I think especially Crime and Punishment, I've heard his longer works.
But to an extent that no other author has the ability to show, which I think is interesting, but I've yet to discover that. When we got off the rails a little bit, we were talking about how our main character, Ivan, I don't know what his name is, but he was sitting in this purgatory of sorts, listening to these spirits talk, and they're arguing. None of it's super duper important to the story, but there was a philosopher that we mentioned earlier, who also was just kind of listening and didn't really interact much with the other worldly people. He didn't.
The sinners.
Yeah, I guess he didn't indulge in their debauchery.
No.
And he's also repeating this word, Bobok, Bobok, Bobok.
Yeah, and he's not really interacting with anyone anymore.
No.
He's sleeping all the time.
Right.
And they said he'll wake up basically like once a week.
Mm-hmm.
But he's been there for about 3 months.
Right.
And they claim that that's the length of time it takes for a soul, I guess, to remove all of its detachments from the mortal world.
Yeah, because body to decompose.
Yeah.
But he's kind of really the only one that gets what Dostoevsky is trying to portray. That why would you argue and debate while you have so little time left?
Yeah.
You should just spend it reflecting and enjoying. I don't want to say enjoying yourself, but
just talking to these people.
Yeah, reflecting.
And having real conversation. Not these just bickering.
Yeah.
They did all their lives.
Yes.
And they're still doing it.
Yeah, and they said old habits die hard, I guess. Even in death, they die hard. But, yeah, the philosopher, which is ironic, not ironic, but incredibly fitting.
I think Dostoevsky might be almost a philosopher himself.
Well, he was a very educated man. His father was a doctor. And I believe his father died when he was very young, and that probably made him a bit cynical, A. And B, it gave him a
I'm sure there's biographies written on Dostoevsky.
Oh, I'm sure. But I'm sure it accelerated his growing up process. It
always does.
Yeah, right. And I think if you would have taken Dostoevsky and in an alternate reality...
Put him in different circumstances.
Yeah, in an alternate reality where his father hadn't died and maybe wasn't a doctor, I don't think he would have been the writer that he was.
Well, you can say that about anything, really.
Right, but...
He could have had worse circumstances and been a totally different writer. But I think, yes, you're right. His circumstances set up a lot of the way he writes.
Yes.
Not today, I can't say today, but the way he wrote during his lifetime.
Having gone through such a hard loss like that, I think shaped his writing style. But, so, this philosopher is just boboking. He's just repeating it after he wakes up. And finally, Ivan kind of coughs, makes like a choking noise.
Yeah.
And all the characters look at him, and they notice him, and then he just wakes up.
Yeah.
Kind of like a nightmare. And he wakes up and he looks around, and he's like, oh, I need to start writing again. And the story just kind of ends there. He wants to go back and work on his writing.
I would be freaked out.
Yeah. And I think this really goes to show how not well the character is, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not judging, but I can't decide if Dostoevsky wanted to portray this purgatory as just another realm of the word that exists, or as an entirely imagined realm.
I think it was just a vehicle for Dostoevsky to tell the story.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. But I'm trying to include meaning.
I thought about that too last night. I said, well, how does his interaction? And I started thinking, because the guy we see Ivan's thoughts on the class systems through the eyes of that too. Mm-hmm. But I think it was just a means of us to see the souls interacting with each other.
Right.
And like you mentioned earlier, how Dostoevsky's personal life might have, or probably did, cause a change in the way that he writes, or greatly affected it. Mm-hmm. I think Russian culture does too, and we mentioned this in our last review. Russian writers are known to be more cynical in nature, like German writers are. I think German writers are the poster child of cynical writing. But I haven't read much German literature. But Russians are too, and we have read some Russian literature. Yeah. And granted, that has been mostly Dostoevsky, but in every single one of his pieces we've read.
It's incredibly cynical.
Incredibly cynical. And especially in White Knight's Love is incredibly cynical. I think in this one, Life and Death is incredibly cynical.
And I read somewhere that, I have two things to say here. I read somewhere that all of Dostoevsky's books are better after a second read, which I'm sure is true for a lot of books.
Yeah.
And I think that if I would read the book again, and even read White Knights again, I would have a different perspective.
I would love to read White Knights again,
Yeah.
because I enjoyed White Knights immensely, but I spent a lot of the book not really nervous, but that was the first Russian piece I've read.
Right.
So I was kind of on edge, trying to understand everything, or making sure I understood everything. I think now that we had the story review, going back and reading it would be a much better experience.
I agree. But the second thing I had to say was that Bobok was a debate of sorts between two of Dostoevsky's editors. They didn't really agree on the direction of his writing at a time, and they used Bobok as a brawling ground of sorts. Yeah. And I don't know enough about the historical context in which it was written to comment on that. I thought it was interesting. But yeah.
And have you thought about this? I read the Penguin Classics version.
Yeah, I did too.
Of it.
And
the
different translations.
White Knights and Bobok are included together.
Yes, we have the same.
In that, I read it on Kindle, but in that ebook, I thought it was interesting how they put that together, those two stories together. I'm not sure how that correlates or if it's supposed to at all.
Yeah.
But I'm curious to see, to read a Dostoevsky story that's outside of that story collection.
A note for the reader. The book is available for free on Project Gutenberg. I will add a link to the book in the description.
And that is legal, but
yeah.
Project Gutenberg is great. But sometimes you have to wonder, too, about the translation quality of some of that stuff.
And I looked at the Project Gutenberg translation, and in my opinion, it was better than the one that we read in Penguin Classics.
Well, I saw that, too, because it was a legendary translator that did it for the Project Gutenberg.
I didn't realize that.
But Penguin Classics is always, you can count on that for being
it's at least
accurate translation.
Right. I just think the quality in terms of syntax is better in the Project Gutenberg one. But another note for the listener, it's only 25 pages long.
It's not long at all.
So really there's no reason not to go out and read it for like an hour, if that, and send us a message and tell us what you thought.
We would love to. We would love to talk to you all about it.
Yeah.
Like with any book review, feel free to reach out to us,
yeah.
or any time really.
Yeah.
You have thoughts on anything that we put out? We'd love to hear your feedback.
Yeah.
Besides that, I think we're done. With every book review, we like to talk about kind of what else we're reading.
Yeah.
What are you reading right now, Ethan?
I'm reading Absolutely American by David Lipsky. David Lipsky was a writer for the Rolling Stone magazine. And he was notoriously anti-military. And his editor assigned him to go do a story on beast training at U.S. Military Academy, also known as West Point. And Lipsky, being anti-military, was like, no, I don't want to do this. But he stayed there throughout Beast, which is the 2-month-long summer training that all new cadets have to go through in order to become a student at West Point. Other service academies have similar trainings.
Boot camp.
Yeah, basically the boot camp, right. And he just kind of fell in love with the process. So he decided to stay for 4 years. He turned what was supposed to be a little article in a magazine into a full-out book. And a graduate of the United States Naval Academy recommended this book to me. And
what's the book called again?
Absolutely American.
Okay.
And it's really good. I really enjoyed it so far. I have about 50 pages left. It's around 300 pages. It's available at the public library. And if you have any inkling of a desire to serve your country or to go to a service academy,
or I guess you're just interested.
Or you're just interested in how they work.
The American system.
Right. It's an excellent read, and it shows all types of cadets. It shows the perfect cadets who are literally the top of the class, the number one in their class, and it shows the cadets who fail every other PT test, because if you fail 2 in a row, you get kicked out. So the cadets understand that, and they kind of take advantage of the system, and they'll fail the first one and then pass the second one, fail the first one, pass the second one. And that's obviously looked down upon.
Yeah.
But it is within the rules, so they don't get kicked out.
I think that would be nerve-wracking, too.
Yeah, right. And there's one character, his name is George Rash. He fails the run section of the PT test almost every time. And one time, he was 1 second away from failing. He just passed. And yeah, it's an excellent book, and it covers like a lot of harsh realities about the service academies that people don't really, and the military in general, that people tend to overlook, like grief. When you lose someone, when you're in the military, that can be incredibly hard, and it can impact your daily operations. And some people are never the same after they lose someone. And it's just an excellent book, and I recommend it to everyone.
Yeah.
What are you reading, Luke?
I'm reading another piece of foreign literature. If Ethan's reading All American, I'm reading All French. Les Mis by Victor Hugo. I've been wanting to read it for a while. It's about the legendary Jean Valjean. He is a convict. He's been in jail for like 20 years. And he's released, basically. And he has to rebuild his life, which is based on lies, in early 19th century France. It's probably the greatest French novel ever written. It was recommended by a teacher. I'm really enjoying it, though. Really enjoying it. French literature, I thought about this when I was reading Bobok, comparing French and Russian literature and how it's different and alike. In this story we read, Bobok talks about French literature and Russian literature. So I'm just really enjoying it right now. I'm trying to make my way through the classics.
Yeah, and there's an interesting linguistic note about that. A lot of Russians around 150 years ago didn't really appreciate Russian as a language. It was viewed as the common language of the poor, and there was a caste system involved, kind of like Luke mentioned. And the higher-ups, the czar, the politically influential people learned French, and they were speaking French, and they would read in French, and that was the language of the royalty. Russian was not always the common language, like I said, and I think it's just interesting how Russian and French are so closely related, and I'm sure that's reflected in a lot of both French and Russian works of literature.
Well, yes, and you see this in modern work and modern situations as well. I mean, it builds nationalism, having a common language. In the Russian-Ukraine war, we see that most Ukrainians speak Russian.
Right.
They're trying to make it a law where they have to speak Ukrainian to kind of build up that sense of nation amongst the populace. So I think the same thing with the Russians, too. A bit more of a national pride.
Right. Yeah, it's just
common language.
It's interesting how the language in which a work is written influences the content. Like, that sounds redundant, but...
And the culture at the time. You think about American culture is different now than it was in the 80s and 90s.
Right.
We think about a country that's 3,000 miles away. Their culture is going to be different today than it is in America.
Yeah.
Or take it back 200 years. What's it going to be like?
Right.
It's going to be extremely foreign to the reader. And I think sometimes that's extremely interesting.
Yeah, I think that's why it can be so challenging.
Challenging, yes, because it's hard to grasp kind of the concepts. And we might see it, we might interpret the story a certain way where when it was written during that time, that wasn't the intention of the author. Because in Les Mis by Victor Hugo, they were really struggling with the class system in France at that time, like you mentioned earlier. So I think it just plays into what you were saying.
And I would like to be able to read Russian and read these originally Russian works in their original language. Obviously, that's not really a possibility.
Well, it's a possibility,
right,
but
I can't just decide tomorrow that,
no,
I'm
it's
gonna
a
read.
long-term.
Right, I can't immediately do this. But I think that reading these works in their original language would give me a massively different perspective on the work.
Absolutely. Well, that was Bobok by Fyodor Dostoevsky.
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 I saw a pronunciation tip last night, and it was toy.
Dostoevsky.
And then Evsky.
Dostoevsky.
Dostoevsky. That's right.
But anyways, I've really enjoyed this one. It was different. It was different. At some points, I was like, what's going on?
Yeah.
But at the end of the story, I grasped the basic overview and I got what he was saying. I think that's what matters.
I think it would benefit from a second reading.
Absolutely. But that was Bobok. Thank you.
Thank y'all for listening.